Okay. All right, folks, welcome to the October edition of the Iranian American Democrats of San Diego. We have a very exciting agenda for you tonight. Dr. Cody Patterson will be here talking about housing, transit, and climate. I personally really enjoy hearing from Cody because of his deep expertise, and I think this will be one of those nights where we're all going to learn a lot. And but first, and I should say the other thing we can talk about at the end, we're not going to be sticklers for time. If we need more time, we can certainly go longer. But just to fill the hour, whatever time we have left, I'd love to give everyone another update on the Build Back Better agenda. The showdown in Washington, we had a good discussion last month. So I'd love to give another update and hear some of your thoughts. So without further ado, I wanted to invite anyone who wishes to make any announcement. We'll keep those to 1 minute each. Please use the little icons and raise your hand, and happy to let you go. All right, Mr. Dave Myers, the floor is yours.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thank you for the invite. I'm sorry the other candidate for sheriff couldn't be here, but my name, for those that know me, is Dave Myers, and I am a Democrat, and I am running for sheriff in San Diego County. I'm very excited to be running for sheriff in San Diego County. Right now, we are seeing a failure of our law enforcement leadership to address community concerns. I've served in law enforcement 35 years in a number of leadership roles, retiring as a commander. It's clear right now that there is a complete failure of leadership, and we see it in things like the highest number of jail deaths of any large jail in the state of California is run by the sheriff's leadership here in San Diego. We've seen just the other day, the sheriff's leadership fails to take a position on vaccine mandates for law enforcement. It doesn't have to be that way. I look forward to coming back and speaking more in depth about the sheriff's department and just how important the chief law enforcement officer, the elected position of sheriff, is in San Diego County to everybody. My name is Dave Myers, and I am running for sheriff. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Myers, and thank you for speaking to our community in the past. I know you spoke at AIAP a number of years ago, and I also would encourage everyone to watch the debate that Voice of San Diego hosted for PolitiFest. You'll have to correct me. I think it was like 2-3 days ago, right?
Yeah. I could actually put the link to the YouTube video in the chat.
I think that would be helpful. And we did try to reach out to Ms. Martinez. We couldn't get the schedule to work for today's meeting, but we will try again in 2022, most likely, to get you both here at the same time. All right, any other public announcements before we start with our exciting presentation?
I just want to say I am actually running for school board in Subdistrict C, but we won't mix that. We won't mix the milk and the meat tonight, but I'd like to seek the endorsement of the club and speak to them at a later date about that as well.
Fantastic. Thank you. Can you tell us just what area that covers, just for everyone's information?
Yeah, of course. Subdistrict C is C for coastal. It is the La Jolla cluster, the Mission Bay cluster, the Kearney cluster, and the Point Loma clusters. So it's basically the coast, and then it cuts in at Kearney.
Okay. Very good. All right. So I'm going to read a quick bio from you in just a second, Cody. But one thing I want to ask is, do you have any slides you wish to present? And do I need to?
I have a PowerPoint. Yeah, I have a PowerPoint.
Let me give you those rights before.
Thank you. And about how much time would you like me to speak for?
We budgeted this much time. If you can see my screen, 35 minutes.
Okay.
including
maybe-
Q&A. You tell us if that's too much, too little. We can see. what
No,
kind
no,
of-
I can always take, I take as much time as humanly
Okay.
provided.
The third item on our agenda is a little fungible there. It's just a place filler just to give people an update. And I think I can do that in 10 minutes or less. So don't be too concerned. I will try to keep watch and make sure that people are getting what they need. I think this is all about education. So I'm sorry, let me go ahead and not this one, advanced sharing, multiple participants can share all participants. Okay, let's try this, Cody. Can you just do a check to make sure? Okay, I need to stop sharing, I think. Why don't you put yours up, and then once you do that, I'll read off your bio for everyone, although I don't think you need much of an introduction.
When I click, it says you cannot start screen share while other participant is sharing.
Okay, can you try one more time?
There we go. Okay.
Seems like a two-step process.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, so let me go ahead and read this. All right, thank you all for joining again. So Dr. Cody Patterson was born, raised, and is now raising a family in La Jolla, California. He holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of California, San Diego, where he studied municipal politics, land reform, and ethnic conflict in Peru's Southern Highlands. He is currently Director of Intergovernmental Affairs and Senior Environmental Advisor to San Diego County Supervisor Terra Lawson-Remer, and serves as Assembly Speaker Anthony Rendon's appointee to the San Diego River Conservancy. He is also a lecturer at UCSD, where he teaches on the politics of environmental change. His work is dedicated to protecting and preserving our natural world, confronting the climate emergency, and fostering equity and equality. All right, Dr. Cody Patterson, welcome to our venue. It's great to have you back.
Thank you, Maz.
So,
It's always a pleasure. It's always a pleasure. Thank you. I wish we were in person. This is, I have a warm feeling for your club. So it's always so welcoming. So maybe someday we'll be able to get back to that.
Someday.
Thank you for having me tonight. I have two settings. One is long-winded and the other is manic. So I'll try. I may have to, given the what we need to cover and the time, I may be in manic mode. But we'll try to pack a lot of information in here. I do have a PowerPoint. It is nothing to write home about, but it will structure the conversation. And then at a certain point, I'll actually switch over and I'll share my the screen on my Google Earth map, and we'll kind of actually go over the map, which will be kind of, I think, kind of interesting and helpful. So let me start by sharing. I'm going to actually share the entirety of my screen. And because I find that if I don't, then it gets a little bit wonky on the, hold on, the PowerPoint. So I'm going to share my desktop here. And then I'm going to run the slideshow, and I'm going to ask if folks can see this. Does everyone see this?
I can see a desktop and a full screen title page.
Full screen. You see this thing that said dual crises,
Yes.
housing and climate?
Dual crisis, housing and climate.
Okay, great. Dual crises, housing, climate. So this is the talk I'm going to give tonight is basically about there's an unfortunate combination of two crises that we're facing, both of which are very difficult to overcome, and they are interacting with one another in I guess it's a positive feedback, but it has negative consequences. So I will start with describing a little bit of where we're at in terms of regional housing. So when we look at where we are in terms of constructing housing for San Diegans, all of us can see that housing is like at the core of our public conversation and concerns about housing. And part of what motivated Maz to reach out tonight was SB 9 and SB 10, which we can talk about a little bit. I honestly don't think those are going to have dramatic impacts. I don't think they're going to have the impacts either the promoters or the detractors think they're going to have. I think it'll be a pretty modest impact at best. But no, everybody agrees that we have a problem, and it's producing a lot of quote solutions that have clearly not actually solved anything right now. So there's something called a regional housing needs assessment that the state performs and then gives numbers that have to be distributed by, in this case, by SANDAG. And so in the fifth cycle, which was 2010 to 2020, the regional RHNA target, residential housing needs assessment target, was 161,980 units. That was in order to keep up with housing demand. That is a number of units that that the RHNA process determined San Diego needed to construct in those 10 years. And we ended up permitting throughout the region, all our jurisdictions, including the county, ended up permitting 73,578. So you look at it, you go, okay, well, that's 40 something, some odd percent. That's not so bad. Here's the challenge. We're going to dig down into those numbers a little bit. The RHNA allocations are not just a raw number in terms of what you have to produce. They are broken down by income categories. And those are categories at which a particular housing unit is affordable. And the definition you'll see at the bottom of affordability is that a household has to pay no more than 30% of its gross income in housing costs, including utilities. So the income categories are 0 to 50%. Oh, and I'll say area median income in San Diego County is $95,100. That's your household. That could be a family of 4, that could be a family of 3, or what have you. So if you look at the categories, they're broken down by 0 to 50% is very low income. That's probably about 36. You can see it's about 40,000 and below. Low income is 50 to 80%. That's whatever, $70,000. And then median income would be right there at in between 80 and 120. And that would be moderate income if you were at the median or slightly above or below. And then above moderate is 120 and plus. Now let's look at how we did in the fifth cycle. It's over now, so we can actually see how we did. So at very low, which is again 0 to 50%, we produced 3,775 units of 36,000 that were targeted. So about 10%. At low, we produced 5,000, a little over 5,000 units of the 27,000 that were targeted, or 28,000 that were targeted. At the moderate, we produced less than 3,000 of the 30,000 targeted, about 9%. And above moderate, 61,987 of the 67,000 targeted. So at above moderate, above 120%, we actually almost hit our target regionally. And in some areas of San Diego, we exceeded our target. And that's typical. That's about what the fourth RHNA cycle looked like as well. Now, but honestly, and here the reality is even more concerning. I'm going to go back to this thing and walk it through. So why is this even more concerning than it seems? I mean, it seems bad that we're only producing 10% or very low, 9%. Well, so let's talk about why these numbers are where they are. You can see we basically hit at our above moderate income, and that's not broken down, but a lot of those are like well above. They're 150, 170, 200% area median income. Those homes were affordable to families or households making that. 9%, the lowest was 2,690, but that's homes that are affordable to people making 80 to 120% area median income. Now, why is that the lowest? Well, because the reality is the market is essentially incapable of constructing a home that is affordable to somebody making very low or low, which is to say 0 to 80% area median income. The market cannot produce it, which means that these homes right here, those were built, the very low and the low, those were actually built using significant public subsidies. They were built, the main mechanism right now is low-income housing tax credits, or LIHTC. They had municipalities kicked in to cover the delta between a market and affordability. You can see that the very low is at 10% because honestly, that affordability is so deep. You have to provide so much additional subsidy to make a home affordable to somebody making 0 to 50% that it's hard to build those. They take a lot of money. And for a given amount of subsidy dollars or low-income housing tax credits, you get a relatively modest number of homes because it's so expensive to cover that difference. The low is your highest, but still only at 20%. And that is, again,
I'm sorry, can you please mute your lines? Let me see if I can find the person. Sorry.
I think, so, okay. So again, there's a lot of, Lighted covered some of that low income at 19%. There was a lot of that again is almost all of those units are produced because there is public subsidy. So really the public is producing those houses in combination with a profit or a nonprofit affordable housing developer. The moderate is almost unsubsidized. There's really no subsidies available for that, which is why that's so low in spite of it being apparently higher, and you would think the market would be more capable. This number right here, 9%, that is a reality of what the market can produce. There's no subsidies there. So that 9% hitting 2,000, only producing in the entire region 2,690 permitted units, not producing, permitting of 30,000, tells you just how hard it is for the market to produce housing that's affordable to moderate income San Diegans. So what does that mean? It means that the market is incapable of producing homes that are affordable to more than half of San Diegans. Probably close to 60% of San Diegans cannot earn enough money to afford, that is, to pay less than 30% of their total monthly income in housing. And again, this is not a shortage of zone capacity. The county has around 50,000 units of additional capacity in its plan. The city of San Diego has around 175,000 units of additional capacity. Faulkner was actually, quite a NIMBY in his own, YIMBY in his own way. He did a lot of upzoning. So it's not zone capacity. It is literally because of the value of land, the value of building materials, the cost of labor. These are just basic economic realities that make it very difficult to produce. Now, there are some proposed market solutions. You can imagine these out of the gates. You have regulatory easing, meaning you could ease your regulations and your rules. You could streamline it, so you could make it faster to get permitting, and that increases the rate of production, but it also reduces the costs and some of that financing. You have to have gap financing until you're starting to get progress on the construction. You could reduce fees, but that is a Prop 13 problem. Because of Prop 13, we're not charging enough property taxes to cover the expenses of the kind of public amenities you would typically need with a house: parks, transportation, public transportation, sidewalks, streets. I mean, we're just basically underfunding these things inherently because of Prop 13, and therefore you have to increase fees. And so to reduce fees on a lot of these things, which would be good because they would allow developers to sort of to produce more housing or produce deeper affordability, is very hard because we really need those fees at this point because Prop 13 is starving us of property taxes. You can also upzone parcels with higher pent-up amenities value. Now, what does that mean? The value of a parcel is really dependent on the surrounding public, private, and natural amenities, which is to say, you can upzone a parcel in the middle of the desert and it won't do anything for you because there are insufficient surrounding amenities to give it value. There aren't roads, there's not transit, there's not restaurants, there's not markets, there's not, unless there's a spectacular view, in which case you have a natural amenity giving value to that. So you could upzone parcels, for instance, on the coast or downtown. Downtown's pretty much already been upzoned to the moon. But it's still, you still run into the same problems of the cost of construction. So what I would say is there are some marginal, there's some marginal ways to ease our housing crisis with those sorts of market solutions that I just described, but really they're not going to produce much. You could maybe get from not being able to produce housing for the bottom 60% to not being able to produce housing for the bottom 50% if you streamlined and reduce regulations and reduce fees. You'd still be facing a basic challenge in producing housing that's affordable to working people. Now, let me say one more thing about that. That's two things. That is, on the one hand, that is a problem in the costs of production. But in the other hand, that's a problem that is a problem of effective demand. which is to say there is a lot of demand for housing, but there is a crisis of effective demand in the sense that that demand for housing is not effective because you do not have, you have 40 years of wage stagnation and asset inflation. So your assets are so overvalued that, and wages have been stagnating for so long that working people, yes, the cost of production is increasing, land values increasing, et cetera. But because wages are stagnating, working people do not have the capacity to purchase it. So you have a crisis of effective demand. And so you could solve it, you can potentially solve it by raising wages as well, which would be great. People like me, and I'm sure a lot of you would love to see wages increase so that working people could start to afford it from that. And that is one, demand side solutions are obviously one part of the thing. So let me set that aside for one moment and talk about our other crisis, and then I'll combine them toward the end. At the end of this, I'll then switch over to pulling up a map and talking about some of the things we're exploring. So we have a climate crisis. I won't belabor the climate crisis. We've talked about the climate crisis before. For San Diegans, there are going to be very real, and there are already very real consequences to this crisis. We really were at the forefront in the very beginning. We were at the front edge of this the fire crisis that we're seeing with a changing seasonality of fire, and meaning that fires are occurring not in, I mean, you can imagine before there were humans here, fires almost exclusively happens when there was storms and lightning came in association very, very frequently with rain. And every once in a while, we'd have like a dry fire out of season, which would create huge, every 70, 80, 100 years, you'd have huge conflagrations where you had fires occurring in some strange, dry lightning storm in off season. But the seasonality of fires changed so dramatically. We're having fires happen in Santa Ana's at the very hottest, driest times of the year with strong winds blowing. Those are the kinds of fire that escape containment. And we have catastrophic fires. So we were at the front edge, 2003, 2007. We really got this right in the beginning, and it's really all over the West now. It's all over the world, really, and it's going to get worse, obviously. You have aridification. So it's not just that we're having droughts, which is periodic droughts, but you actually have a long-term aridification of our region, which means even without a drought, the drought could be over, but you will still see reduced rainfall and reduced humidity in the air. You're going to see just drier climate. San Diego's projected to get some monsoonal moisture, so we'll get some moisture in the summers, and it'll be much more like Baja, so it'll be very hot throughout the year. But it'll be a warmer winter than it traditionally has been, and the summers will be hotter, but we'll get periodic monsoon rains. That's the projected outcome. Again, droughts, very serious droughts, which has consequences for humans, but also for our natural world, obviously, and biodiversity. You have just heat outright. You have migration. I mean, this thing is going to be causing mass migration all over the world. I think Mexico is projected by 2100 to have 1.5 to 6 million climate refugees. I mean, it's going to be crazy, really, as vast swaths of the world become really uninhabitable. And their water runs out, in addition to just the raw heat and drought. And then you're going to have flooding. So, I mean, yes, it's going to be warmer and drier to a certain extent, but rains are going to increasingly fall in catastrophic downpours. And so anyhow, climate crisis. Now, the main way we do have to adapt to those crises, and that'll be part of the story is how we adapt. I mean, one of the ways is obviously, as you'll see, is ensuring that development does not occur in the backcountry at high fire zones and very high fire zones. But setting aside the question of adaptation, we have our main path right now has to be to reduce GHG, greenhouse gas emissions, so that we are not contributing to the problem. And if you look at the sources of GHG emissions in San Diego, you can see here 24%. This is for the unincorporated county. I work for the county, so I think about the county, but it's similar throughout. 24% is coming from electricity. We should be able to reduce that fairly quickly. We have community choice energy. We just joined San Diego Community Power, so we'll be able to reduce that. Other elements is, I mean, the biggest issue, and you can see it right here, 45% is on-road transportation. And so, really, there's no way for San Diego County as a region and San Diego County, the unincorporated county, to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions without reducing the emissions of on-road transportation. And we do have some things in addition to seeing those sources and seeing the problems that we're going to have. We actually have state legislation that mandates climate action. And there's a lot of vehicles for this, some of which are governor's orders, but the main legislation is 2006's AB 32, which targeted 1990 levels by 2020, which represented a 15% reduction from business as usual. SB 32, which is really what we live with more now, is a 40%. The 2016 is a mandate for for jurisdictions to reach 40% below their 1990 levels by 2030. That's what we live with a lot, and that's where climate action plans come from. And certainly, the county's climate action plan is geared predominantly around SB 32, 40% reduction from 1990 levels by 2030. And more recently, I guess it's 2013, SB 743, and we've been wrestling with that all year with the county, and that's a complicated bill that we can talk about at some point. But basically, what it did, it replaced level of service analysis under CEQA with vehicle miles traveled. So what it basically did is it discouraged sprawl development and it encouraged infill development, and it has various consequences, but we're not going to get into that right now. So that's the basic, that's my intro discussion here. And so what I'll say, I'll talk a little bit, just talk a little. Let me stop sharing here for a second, and then I'm going to share my Google Earth. But so what you have is a sort of a pincer movement between the housing crisis, and that housing crisis, to be clear, it could be unfolding in a situation in which there was no climate crisis, right? I mean, you could have a situation in which actually it's totally fine, and frankly, you could have a situation in which people didn't care about habitat. San Diego is the most biodiverse county in the country, but you could have a situation in which our constituencies just didn't really care about that. And so you could attempt to solve some of those challenges by sprawling further and further out into the backcountry and forcing longer commutes on working people. And some people, we could probably get a certain amount of density through that. Of course, these are sprawl projects, so you're really only getting at most 2,000 or 3,000 per project. That's a lot of projects to get your 170,000 over, 10 years. But still, you could, in a paradigm in which people didn't care about the environment and they didn't care about climate, or there wasn't a climate crisis facing us, they could do that to a certain extent. And you can get, actually, homes in the unincorporated county tend to be are $30,000 more on average than homes in the incorporated areas of San Diego. So it's not true that you get affordable housing out there, but you could, in theory, produce stick-built, that is like 2x4 built homes, 1 and 2 stories out there. And you could get some price reduction. Of course, as you move farther and farther out into the unincorporated county, the topography gets more and more difficult, which means you have to spend more and more money leveling it, enforcing the backside. You have to do a lot more work in terms of land movement, which increases the cost. But still, you could attempt to solve your problem that way. On the other hand, we could be facing a climate crisis and not be facing a housing crisis. That is to say, developers could be perfectly capable of building the kinds of homes we needed to solve the climate crisis. Dense homes, multifamily homes, and we could have the resources to, with appropriate fees to cover the additional costs and burdens that building those homes produces. We could have parkland. We could be turning our canyons into restoring them and turning. I mean, there's a lot of things if we didn't have affordable housing crisis that would make it easier to solve the climate crisis. Unfortunately, we have this positive feedback between the climate crisis and the housing crisis, which makes the problem particularly difficult to solve. And I'm going to give you some sort of graphic representation of that. Am I okay for time still? I'm trying to move fairly quickly.
You have at least 10 more minutes, and honestly, we can extend it. So don't worry.
Okay. Is this good? Are people understanding what I'm saying?
This is excellent from my perspective.
Okay. Okay. So I'm going to now share my my Google Earth Pro. Let's hope this works. All right. Can folks see my beautiful Google Earth Pro here? All right, I'm
Yes,
gonna
we can
make
see.
it a little bigger. Do you see that? Yes.
Yes, we can see. We've seen
Okay.
San Diego.
So-
That looks like San Diego County.
That is San Diego County. Over here, can you see my cursor?
Yes, we do.
Okay, so this here is La Jolla. Here's Coronado, Point Loma. You know, up here you have Oceanside. Here's Pendleton, etc. So so if you look at this map and you see these little red lines are all the planning areas of the unincorporated county. That's what at the county, the supervisor Lawson-Remer and the other supervisors, that's what we have purview over in terms of land use. So when we're developing a climate action plan, it is in relation to the unincorporated county. We're not, other jurisdictions have to develop their own climate action plans. But so we're thinking about this unincorporated county. And if you look at this unincorporated county, you start to see an interesting, so what happened in the old paradigm is, as I mentioned, the unincorporated county in the current plan, which was updated in 2011, it has about 50,000 units of zone capacity, which is like insane. If we were ever to build that many units in the unincorporated county, it would be a complete calamity because it would mean that we're building way, way out far, which generates a lot of VMT, which is vehicle miles traveled, which is to say, if you live out in Ramona and you're commuting every day, you are driving a lot in your car. You are emitting, unless you have a Tesla or something, you are emitting a lot of greenhouse gas emission, pardon me. You are emitting a lot of greenhouse gases, predominantly carbon. And so really to build out 50,000 would be a catastrophe. Now, what is happening now is everybody's acknowledging that there's really, even given what's happening, it's really very hard to imagine a full build out of that unincorporated county. But what happened in 2011 is they created a general plan update, which took the density essentially out of the unincorporated, like, you know, the backcountry, and put it into villages. Villages like Alpine, Ramona, Lakeside, Rainbow, it just pulled it into these villages. But even now you can look at it and those villages are still way out there. Julian, they're still way out there. And to the extent that we're constructing homes out there, it is problematic from a greenhouse gas perspective because those are producing very long trips and a lot of vehicle miles traveled and a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a recognition that in response to state legislation and in response to sort of a changing attitudes, that we will have to change the way we develop now, or shift where we put our density. And so toward that end, let me talk a little bit about that. The supervisor also sits on SANDAG and I staff her on SANDAG. So it's clear that on the one hand, in terms of climate, we are going to need to have dense, multifamily, mid and high rise that is transit supportive. That's really the only path. Now, San Diegans are not traditionally accustomed to living in tall multifamily homes or tall multifamily communities. That is how we're going to have to live. And it will take some culture change. And part of the problem is we do not have a lot of park land. We have a lot of open space in the backcountry and we have our beaches. But when you look at the park acreage per 1,000 residents or whatever your criteria is, it's very low. So when San Diegans think about transitioning to living in high rises, part of why they recoil is because we do not have the kinds of park amenities that create the kind of shared space that would be necessary to live in that with that kind of density. And in a certain sense, like I think there's a reduced, like native San Diegans, like certainly like Euro-American San Diegans do not have a culture of sharing public space in quite the same way. I mean, if you go to La Jolla Cove, we used to always marvel growing up about how, for instance, and we're at the Iranian American Club, but how the Persian community, its enthusiasm for using public parks and public spaces to celebrate and share together is really, I think, a model for a lot of us. You know, you still go to La Jolla Cove and there's still a lot of Persian families and Latino families who are actually sharing public space in a way that, you know, a lot of sort of affluent Euro Americans are not accustomed to doing. We really have prized our private backyards and not shared that kind of space, or nuclear family backyards, and not shared that space. So obviously there'll be some culture changes that are involved in this, but it's pretty clear that that will have to happen. Now, how does that happen when we have we have very poor transit? I mean, we have the trolleys, but we have poor transit. Well, I'm going to give you a couple examples of the way in which we think of the future of San Diego. And I said I'd talk about transit. I will talk about transit here. I'm going to pull up a map of this is, I think. So let me find where it is here. I have a very, very attractive map of the new purple line, which is not showing up here. Oh, here it is, the proposed purple line. So if you see this is the proposed purple line. Does anyone see the purple line there that I just introduced to the map? I'll zero in on it.
Yes, we see the purple line.
So if you look at this purple line, it goes from the planned East Otay port of entry to the San Isidro port of entry, up through San Isidro, up into Chula Vista, up into National City, and then up through South San Diego, up into City Heights, down into Kearny Mesa, and then now we're into Kearny Mesa, Mission Valley, then Kearny Mesa, then across to UTC. And if you see, and then let me put the job centers on here. So part of the strategy has to be putting residential density where there are already jobs. It's very hard to move jobs. So if we look at here, let's look at Kearny Mesa. Sereno Valley is the #1 tier 1 job center in San Diego. Many of you are probably familiar with the 56 corridor and the tech jobs in the 56 corridor and Sereno Valley. This is the highest density of the highest tier 1 job center. I think it's 127,000 jobs or something. This is a close second, actually. Kearny Mesa is actually a close second. So you can imagine a purple line that's bringing working families. Today, one of the major drivers of greenhouse gas emissions in our region is people coming from San Isidro, Chula Vista, National City, El Cajon, Southeast San Diego, and commuting all the way north in the morning up here to Sereno Valley, and commuting all the way south at the end of the day back to their homes. Imagine if we had a paradigm in which you have, we're already seeing a little bit, those of you who have been in, everyone's familiar with UTC, but you can see the kind of density that's going in around UTC, and that currently has the trolley line. But if you look at the, let me show you, the Lawson corridor, we anticipate having realignments that will most likely go through, no, that's not it. You'll have we will undoubtedly have a Del Mar tunnel to pull those rails off, that rail off the coast. And that will then go into, and then you'll have a cut. You'll most likely have a Lawson corridor, which is the rail line, the high-speed rail line that's going to go from downtown up all the way to Los Angeles. It will come past, the most likely realignment will be UTC. And then if you bring this line, this doesn't show it, but this line will also come probably through UTC and then up to Sereno Valley. So UTC will become, it'll have the Lawson corridor, it'll have the purple line coming from the south, and it will have the trolley line. You get that kind of density at UTC. You're going to have that kind of residential density emerging in Sereno Valley if we implement this vision. That will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, make for much more livable cities, and produce a lot of additional housing. Now, let me tack back. A little bit, and at the risk of losing folks. Here we are laying out a vision of what this city could look, or this region could look like, if we had transit connecting working people to jobs, and if we had dense residential density on top of jobs, basically on top of jobs. I mean, imagine a Kearny Mesa in which on Convoy, you had two transit stations, one in the south, one in the north, and you had very high quality jobs restaurants, amenities, and residences. It's really, I mean, that's really the path we have to take. But the challenge is it's going to be very expensive. We cannot produce housing that's affordable to working people even now, and that's even townhomes. Imagine if you have to build very complex building projects with steel and concrete and still try to make them affordable. It's very difficult to imagine. So that gets me to, and this will basically just be a question mark, and it will be a sort of tune in, but this is the supervisor's project and our project. We have a guy named Jeff Yuen who comes from New York's Housing Committee, and has done a lot of work on housing finance. And he is in our office now, and I'd love to have him come sometime. But the environmental side and the land use side of our office is working with Jeff Yuen and working with staff and working with Sandag staff to try to create a vision to figure out how we can help fund, not just how we can make these projects pencil for market rate housing, but how we can make these projects pencil and how the public can help support the construction of affordable housing. Because if these are not mixed income, vibrant communities, it's not going to help. 4 out of every 5 jobs, 3 to 4 out of every 5 jobs is a service job. So to have incredibly expensive housing in Sereno Valley does not help you. You're still bringing your 3 to 4 out of 5 jobs from National City or Chula Vista all the way north. You actually have to have working people able to live in those communities. And this is setting aside schooling as well, so you can have teachers living in the same communities they teach. So we have several proposals. We're working through Sandag. Just on Friday, we established a regional equitable housing subcommittee to start talking about the nexus between transit and housing, affordable housing and affordable housing finance. We're trying to think through potential sources of revenue to cover that delta on affordable, including mechanisms like land value capture, where you take some of the value that's created in the private sector in land by these investments and you capture some of that for the public. The public is spending the money on the amenity. We should be able to capture some of that to cover the delta on affordable. Likewise, upzoning windfalls. In a lot of places throughout the world, they're realizing that when you upzone, that is, you give more capacity to a property owner and they have more profit-making potential, the public created that value, or they released that pent-up value by changing the zoning, and the public should capture some of that and use that to cover the difference on the affordable. So there's a lot of, that's just one mechanism, land value capture. There's a lot of linkage fees, there's a lot of different mechanisms, but we need to pony up as a public, because the costs of both solving our housing crisis and solving our housing crisis in a way that is climate and environmentally friendly is going to be expensive, and the public is going to have to play a role. So I'll close right there. I exceeded my time, but I hope some of that was useful. And if you have any questions, I can take them now.
Thank you very much, Cody. That was excellent. This is exactly what I was looking for. And I think that's what we were all looking for. And just on a quick programming note, we're going to do away with my spiel about the Build Back Better plan. I'm going to fuse some of my questions into the Build Back Better, but that was just a time filler. So we do have about roughly 15 minutes. I think we're going to start losing people around 7 o'clock, but I'm personally willing to stay longer if there's enough people. So please raise your hand if you have questions. I'm up to like 3 questions myself, but I'm going to try to go at the end. So Maury, why don't you go first?
Let me unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can, Maury.
Good. Cody, thank you very much for a valuable presentation. Could you put your contact information on the chat so that I'm an idea man. I'm not applying for any job, but I would love to participate in some of your meetings to give some ideas. One of the ideas that I have is that we need some feeder lines to bring people to the trolley lines, to trolley stations. That seems to be lacking. I live in Claremont, and I know a lot of the senior citizens would like to use the trolley lines, but they need to have some feeder lines to bring them from their residence to the stations. I have the idea of perhaps we need to build some of these high-density buildings over the rail lines. MTS has a lot of right-of-way properties. They could build if they have them, and MTS can easily set up an entity with some developers to build affordable housing on their properties along their lines. We could perhaps also think about some community gardens along the idea of parks. People living in affordable housing, they need, and they do that in Europe, they need to have community gardens close to their apartment buildings so that they could plant some of the vegetables that they would like to eat. And that actually encourages people to think about living in affordable housing or in apartment buildings rather than wanting to live in a house. The other idea that I have is for some people who are retired, perhaps the zoning in faraway areas, like in San Isidro, in East County, in South County, if you reduce the zoning, because land is one of the major items of cost in building. So people could build tiny homes in small lots of like 4,000 square feet, 5,000 square feet, rather than 30,000 square feet, rather than 20,000 square feet. So these are some of the ideas that I'm sure people like you already know, but people need to be educated about new ideas. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Maury. Yeah, I'll just say there's a lot of material. I will say that is like part of the reasoning behind SB 9, which has been very controversial. But that is, SB 9 basically involves this sort of the by right ability to split your lot in two and then build a duplex on each one. And so that would produce homes on smaller footprints. And in general, smallness is like, there's some talk about potentially allowing smaller units. This is even with multifamily. You know, a lot of our zoning requires very, very large square footage, which is not necessarily typical globally. And it could be that we could have some smaller homes and smaller units, whether they're in a home or a multifamily. Yeah, I'd love to talk more, Maury. I put my contact information right there in the chat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, why don't we go with Amira next?
Hi, doctor. How are you?
Good.
Good. All this talks is very good, and I hear you. But I work in Penasquito. I live in Penasquitos and work in Conroe Valley, so east to west, not south to north.
Mm-hmm.
We are having transportation problem and traffic. The only way to get there is 56, and 56 is like a death trap with only 2 lanes to go, and you can't even take side roads. Is there any plan at all to build something? And there's no public transportation at all to go. The only bus that comes near me is number 20, and that goes toward downtown and Fashion Valley, Mission Valley, all of that, or it goes south. Is there any plan to ease up the traffic for that area? That's number 1. And then number 2, do you want to answer that and then I go to my number 2?
Yeah. So yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, that northeast San Diego is like one of the hardest nuts to crack in terms of the RTP, a regional transportation plan. It's one of the hardest things to crack. Some of that can be eased. There is a planned BRT. Bus rapid transit is really the sort of fastest way you can get these things up and running. So there are plans for HOV lanes, and there probably won't be, given the 56 is complicated. I have not taken a deep dive in the 56, but at the very top end, there is opportunity to using medians and sort of a more judicious use of medians and roadsides to actually get an additional lane or two and to dedicate some of that to HOV. I have a certain amount of skepticism about the willingness of folks in those areas to use public transit. You know, what I will say, so I don't have a lot of very good solutions for you in the short term, unfortunately. And as you can imagine, I mean, even if you were to, you can't really widen it because there's dedicated open space and communities on either side. So you get a couple additional lanes probably from using the space more judiciously or the footprint more judiciously. What I will say is this, I mean, I think the most important thing, we are cognizant of it. Obviously, it's part of the supervisor's district. She's concerned about it. We've talked to Sandex staff about it and we're exploring options. But I will say in the principle is the most important principle is that area is a perfect example of when you let developers' profit motives generate your planning, which is like really the developers made huge profits, walked away, and the traffic you're facing is an externality of that developer's profit. You know, they made the profit and they walked away and left you with the traffic. They didn't pay into the roads adequately. They didn't pay into the services adequately. They didn't pay into the park space adequately. And now you're left in a community that does not have those services and in which you're spending 2 hours a day in traffic. So we are, I'll just say, I encourage your ongoing input. There's my contact information. We are in ongoing conversations with Sandag about how to ease some of these things. Some of them will be addressed by, you know, I do believe that certain amounts of that traffic will be reduced to a certain extent by different forms of on-demand, electric on-demand automated vehicles. And there's a lot of like hope for that in terms of Northeast County. I'm not sure how much that'll really address, but stay in contact with the office. If you have ideas or if you have concerns about the way you see it unfolding, let me know. Broadly speaking, the answer is we can never do development like that again, because it's really a catastrophe that imposes those burdens on.
Well, I was going to tell you about like when Kilroy was trying to set up that community in Carnal Valley, they were taking signatures, and I told them flat out that I will not sign because I know it would cause a lot of traffic and a lot of issues for us. They made that development in I think it's Camino del Sur, and that also has caused a lot of all these people, all these houses are coming, and then of course companies are coming, but then these 2 lanes that stay, and you can't even take the back road because that's just as dense as the freeway. Anyway, that's one of my concerns. The other one is affordable housing. I keep hearing that from every candidate, and Todd Gloria talks about it beautifully, and everybody in county talks about it, but I don't see it based on what the numbers that you're showing. It's really obvious. But even talking about rental housing, there are issues about that as well, because I see like beautiful new buildings are being built, and I think, okay, part of it is going to be affordable, but then the rents are more than what I'm paying right now by $500-600, sometimes $1,000 more. And I don't see that as affordable housing. I don't know how these houses are, these apartment buildings are authorized if they're not providing affordable housing for us. I'm not considered poverty. I'm above poverty, but I'm not loaded either on the upper level, but I can't afford to move from where I am because nothing matches with where I am right now. Everything is higher. Is there anything to fix that?
Yeah, so I mean, look, COVID has made this even worse. I mean, we've seen, I think 21 since the beginning of COVID, we've seen a 21% increase in home sale prices. I mean, it's insane. I mean, it's really just, it's made a bad problem even worse. What I'll say is, and not to like go onto the macro level again, there's a lot of talk about housing. we would have to produce massive, like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of houses very rapidly in order for the market to drive down the cost of housing. It's just not, that's not in the foreseeable future. The housing construction is not going to, it's not going to glut the market so much that you see housing prices decline. And frankly, the second it started glutting the market, they'd stop making it. So, you know, I mean, they're not going to build into a glut. So the idea that the market's going to come to save us, we definitely need additional housing. That's clear. We have a supply problem. But if that housing is market rate, it is not going to help the majority of working families, as you say. So here's what I would say. The part of what's driving the increase in home values is the federal government's kind of made a devil's bargain. It said, we're going to keep the economy afloat, but we're going to do it using fiscal means. We're going to use the Federal Reserve to dump lots and lots of capital in. And then in a search for yield, capital is going to go and it's going to prop up your asset prices. Whatever that asset is, it's going to prop up asset, the predominant one being home values. So the Federal Reserve is just dumping money. Stimulus is dumping money. Everybody's dumping money to floating all these asset prices. And it's causing what you would expect, inflation. But when housing prices inflate, we call it appreciation, but it's just inflation of asset prices. Unfortunately, the devil's bargain comes in if you keep the economy afloat by lifting up the very top of it. Anybody who doesn't have access to an asset they're left in a worse situation than before, because now you floated the assets and you've kept the whole economy from collapsing, I guess, but at the cost of increasing inequality. So if you don't own an asset, if you don't own a home, you're completely out of luck. And you're in a much worse situation when you were 3 years ago. So there is only one path out of this thing. I mean, there's a lot of paths. We have to do a lot of things. But if we do not find a way to generate revenue from that portion of the economy that is inflating assets, stocks, and property, if we do not, and corporations, and if we do not find a way to levy some sort of, in some way generate revenue from that to cover some of the costs of affordable, to make it more affordable, it's not going to naturally become affordable in the foreseeable future, whatever we do. So as you point out, we are going to need a lot of mechanisms that do not yet exist for helping produce social housing, public housing, or helping the market produce affordable housing. Either way, the public is going to have to pony up. And that means the people who have been benefiting from this economy are going to have to help to generate revenue in order to cover the people that are in desperation. Sorry to be like,
what about rent ceiling, a ceiling to a cap, a roof for rental, so at least people don't become homeless because they can't afford their rents?
Well, you've seen it, you saw it over the last 30 years. You saw it with the decline in SROs. The city of San Diego eliminated 10,000 SROs, allowed them to be turned into luxury hotels, and now we have 10,000 homeless people living on the streets, and we're saying, why don't they have homes? Well, SROs was the bottom rung on our housing market, and that's where many of the people who are now on the street would have been housed in single resident occupancies, many downtown. If you guys, lots of you remember downtown. So anyhow, I hope that answered some of the question. I went a little long. Maz, did you have a question? Thank you, by the way.
Let me try to wrap up with my questions. Thank you. This is very informative. Two questions. One is about the housing aspect. You showed the subsidies. I think the first two categories you showed were subsidy supported, and then the next two were not. How much, do you have any idea how much Build Back Better plans to remedy that, if at all? And keeping in mind with the big caveat that it's being massively watered down in real time. But just in theory, is that going to help that equation?
I do not believe there is some additional, I believe there's some additional Section 8 and some HUD funding. The irony is, I don't think that there is. I'll have to double check this. And again, I should not speak to it because I don't know it objectively, but I do not believe that there is like massive, and again, this is 3.5, even the maximum 3.5 trillion is over 10 years. So it's really only $350 billion a year.
Right.
And that's spread over a lot of different things. And I do not believe that there is some increase in HUD budget, I believe, and in Section 8, but
There's definitely something called housing. There's definitely
Yeah.
some housing
yeah,
buckets. I don't know exactly where.
yeah, there's a component. But again, I mean, the part of the problem is the scale of this thing is massive. I mean, like with low-income housing tax credit homes, and part of the reason why what's called LIHTC or low-income housing tax credits, which is actually, that's the number one mechanism producing quote affordable housing, but it's being done as a tax credit. So there's all kinds of problems with LIHTC, although it does produce some housing, but at the cost of losing us tax revenue. So it's very expensive, and in fact, your average LIHTC home here in San Diego, I think, costs $600,000 to produce, $600,000 to produce that unit of housing. So it's very expensive to produce affordable housing. We will need new mechanisms and new funding streams.
Got it. And then the second question is about the transit. I think you showed 45% of greenhouse gases are from transportation. Under the most aggressive, let's say the Hassan Akrada plan, and I don't actually know where it is now, but let's just say the most aggressive one imaginable in San Diego. How much do you expect that, or have you figured out how much that 45% you expect to drop if we, transform our economy into it? Like, what's the range? Are we talking about a few percentage points, or?
Well, it's a little bit difficult to say. There is a target of what these transit investments will produce, and Jack Shu's going to kill me. I think it's not as much as you would imagine. I think that by 20, no, I'm not going to butcher it, but it's somewhere around 20% is the targeted reduction. But what I'll say is, part of the challenge with Sandag does not have land use authority. So Sandag can produce the transit, and a jurisdiction can or cannot respond to that. And in fact, it's hard sometimes, and that's part of why we created the subcommittee for regional equitable housing subcommittee, is we really need to start coordinating, because if you have a job center in Sorrento Valley or Kearny Mesa or downtown, and you have residents in another jurisdiction, it's not like they're just different places in the same jurisdiction. Some are in the city of San Diego, some are in, Del Mar, Encinitas, or Escondido, but your jobs and your housing may be in, you know what I'm saying? They're all over, they're in different jurisdictions, which means given that neither the county, which only has land use purview over the unincorporated county, nor Sandag, which has no land use authority, just has transportation authority. Neither of us can actually coordinate to make sure that the development policy in Chula Vista is articulating with the development policy, say, in North San Diego or in Escondido. So part of what the subcommittee we'd like to do is to create a mechanism where these jurisdictions can voluntarily and consensually coordinate their development models. So yes, Sandag has a certain target in terms of what the GHG reductions it will achieve, but the real power is going to come from the synergy between those transit investments and region and jurisdictions that have land use authority changing their land use to properly articulate. So we're shooting for significant reductions through our CAP and through other and our regional decarbonization framework that we're currently adopting right now. And so that we, in fact, once we get the Sandag investments or the commitment to invest, and we change our land use policy to correspond to that, that's where we really hope to get the big reductions, is the coordination between the transit and the land use.
Okay, perfect. So it sounds like it's more, you can't just look at the transportation piece alone. You really have to look at the housing framework or the housing topology changes to make the full equation work. I totally get it.
Exactly.
I'm sorry, one last question. You mentioned the purple line, and I know we had a Sandag presenter a couple of months ago. Is that trolley? Is that what's the form of transportation there?
So we do not.
You do not know. Okay.
I don't know if I should speak for the supervisor, but in general, I don't think trolleys, I don't think that's the right mechanism. It doesn't go quickly enough. it frequently travels at grade. You don't want things to be at grade. You have to stop everything. And we would like to see an actual commuter line, heavy rail, that is actually elevated, or tunnels throughout, so that instead of running on, the old model was that you would have a purple line or lines in general that would travel around along freeways. Now they like that because it helps with it helps with the easements. It helps basically with your right of way, and it reduces the cost. And it, in a certain sense, it makes it simpler because you're like on a freeway like median or a freeway roadside in the same right of way as that freeway or that rail. The challenge is, part of why we're doing this is to get these, is to increase the development potential and have that radius, that like half-mile radius of easy access, to be densely residential. But if you're running along the freeway, in general, freeways present a barrier, and barriers reduce like the vivacity and interchange that kind of generates like urban vitality. So your freeways typically produce this zone of depressed activity, and you're running your rail across it, and then your stop is right along the freeway. Well, you've lost half of that zone of like of increased amenity value and increased activity and increased zoning potential because you're on the freeway. Whereas if you run it as an elevated or a tunnel through the heart of these cities, boom, half mile, that can be, 12, 20 square blocks of upzoning and restaurants and light industrial, and you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
We really want to run these things as a commuter rail right through the hearts of these cities.
Okay, that's actually pretty clear. Thank you again. I know we went over time, but it was very, very valuable to all of us. I hope to have you here again soon. So unless if there's any other final comments or questions, I think I'd like to move on to the next item on the agenda. Thanks again, Cody.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
All right. All right, everyone. I'm going to move on to the next agenda item, next and final agenda item. I'm going to skip the Build Back Better that, as I mentioned, is being camouflaged as we speak. But I think if any of you heard our meeting from last month, or you want to watch the recording, you probably already knew that. So history is just, those predictions, I think, are probably largely true. So let's go to the financial report with Amire, and just I want to use this as an opportunity to remind everybody to please renew your membership. It's that time of the year. We kind of went easy on this last year because of COVID, but this year we really ask that you renew your membership. We really, if you can, it's $25, and that helps us get a voice in within the party. So let me pass it on to Amira. John, you're next.
Merci. Our balance in our bank is $1,765.53. There's a $47 in transit of the 2 new membership that were paid recently. And the good news is that we got our money back, that the bank had deducted it from our bank account. It took several months, 6-7 months, but we got it, so we're good now.
Thank you for your tenacity getting that. And I should also add that we do have, and I think I mentioned this before, we do have a PayPal way of renewing your membership, which also took many months to establish, believe it or not. I don't know if it's the word Iranian, the name Iranian seems to not be a good thing these days, but that's just a suspicion. So anyway, we have an easy way for you to renew. Thank you for
your tenacity on that one. I know it took a lot of phone calls, hours and hours of phone calls with PayPal.
Yeah, so I think that hopefully makes it easier for everyone to use. Any final questions and thoughts? All right, we can close it here. Thank you guys very much, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.